Check one. Check two. Welcome to Mindfulness Off the Cushion. If you're familiar with the challenges of living mindfully and are looking for help in your daily dance with suffering, our goal is to be a resource for you. So let's jump straight in to Mindfulness Off the Cushion, brought to you by the Austin Mindfulness Center. Welcome, everyone, to Mindfulness Off the Cushion, episode 10. We finally get to go down the rabbit hole of ego. What the heck is it? What does it have to do with mindfulness? Christina, would you mind getting us started?
Sure. So I'll take a stab at it. Obviously, it's a complex, multifaceted concept. So it's a bit difficult to pin down because kind of what we've spoken about in the past, there's so many flexible definitions or applications of how the ego works. But one piece I would say is that it is one piece of who we are or one piece of our psyche. It's how we exist. And the ego plays a part in all ways that we exist and how we think and how we are and how we emote and how we behave and how we think and how we experience the world. We can go back to ego psychology or Freudian psychology related to the ego. Sometimes our ego makes us think that we are in complete, quote unquote, control of our ego. Then we sort of remember sometimes that a big part of our ego is subconscious. I like to use the metaphor of the ego. So our car being our life and our ego trying to drive our car and take control, again, quote unquote, control over our car, and instead to see it more as a valet, that they don't own your car, they don't own your life. They are parking your car, but it's one piece of it that I think is helpful in my personal and professional experiences where people almost like to villainize the ego. So I don't know why I'm like on vigilante team ego right now, but there's a big part of having to befriend the enemy in that way. And sometimes the enemy is our ego.
Yeah.
That's all I got.
I'm going to preface my answer with saying that my allergies are ravaging me today. So if you're wondering why I sound like a sexy jazz singer, it's because I have no use of my sinuses right now. And I'm so hopped up on like meds and vitamins that I'll be happy if like 80% of what comes out of my mouth today makes sense. But here we go. I like the valet metaphor. I think that's it's a good visual because we don't hand the keys to a valet and cross our fingers that we'll get the car back. It's this understanding that for this specific purpose, for this brief amount of time, you're driving the car. To understand ego, you got to kind of take a step back. It was first, like Christina said, introduced by Freud. And Freud's whole thing was this: we're driven by a pleasure principle, that our existence as humans is to seek out pleasure. And Freud use that to talk about sex a lot because, sex is kind of fun, but there's more than just the sex in terms of like pleasure seeking stuff. And then so much so that Freud realized that there was this need for balance because we can't just be a hedonistic society that only looks for pleasure. And again, not just sex, but overindulging in food, overindulging in recreational activities, overindulging in drug use or whatever. It was in one of his essays that he first introduced the idea of ego as a balance between the two extremes of our pleasure seeking and morality compasses. So there's the id, the ego, and the superego, which if you take an intro to psychology class, you might be familiar, where the id is the pleasure seeking, the hedonistic part of ourselves that only wants to stay out late, even though we have work tomorrow, or, eat that second dessert or go fight that person because they made you mad. Like that will make me feel better, is to take control of the situation. And then the super ego is the other side of that. If you're fans of like the OG Looney Tunes, and there was the cartoon episodes with the little angel on one side and the little demon on the other, saying back and forth, like, yes, you should do that. No, you shouldn't. This is the overcorrection of morality. And then the ego's function is to be right in the middle because we can't be one or both extremes. So this is where our original idea and concept of ego was developed. Flash forward to present day, there's not a lot that's carried over from Freud's work because Freud's work came a lot from introspection. It wasn't based on science. It wasn't necessarily tested and retested. And what was tested and retested did carry over into what's now considered contemporary psychoanalysis. But ego, the term ego has become more of just a colloquial term for our sense of self. It's not necessarily playing that same role of the referee that balances our morality and our hedonistic impulses. There's a lot of authors today that are using the term ego to show how we range or judge ourselves based on others. And sometimes it's within our conscious awareness. Sometimes it's without our conscious awareness, because as we're developing in pre-adolescence and adolescence, we're using that social learning theory. We're looking for others to learn how to talk, learn how to walk, learn how to engage with people. And that doesn't necessarily leave us in adulthood. It's, ooh, they have that. Should I have that? They're acting that way. Should I be acting that way? They're fans of this sports team. Should I be fans of this sports team? And it's really easy to let ego, like to borrow Christina's metaphor, like drive the car, because do I need to be better? Do I need to be doing this, rather than kicking ego out of the car and realizing this is what it is? And the reason I was excited to talk about ego in terms of mindfulness is that not that ego is a part of mindfulness, but ego is one of those things that could be a barrier from practicing mindfulness to its fullest capacity. When we're sitting in meditation, we're like, ooh, I'm meditating harder than anybody else in this room. Boom, like ego's in the driver's seat. You're saying, I'm going to be this mindfulness master in a year. That's ego talking. Like, who cares if it's a year or 2 years? This sense of, I need to strive to be best or to be better or to at least be ahead of the class is ego. And I also am just now realizing as I'm talking, I missed the opportunity to wear one of my favorite shirts. I has one that says, ego is not your amigo, but I might wear that next time. But this is such a rich conversation, so I don't want to dominate the whole introduction. Claudio, what have you got for ego?
I love what you said about the ego. I guess in more contemporary terms is kind of become synonymous with the sense of self, right? So there is that component that we identify the ego as a component of the self. I think that Christina also alluded to that by saying that the ego is one piece of who we are. It's not the whole story of who we are, but it is a very important piece. There is certain functions that the ego provides for us, one being sense of self and the other being a confidence of who we are and self-esteem. There is definitely a place for ego in our study of mindfulness, in our practice of mindfulness. For a lot of individuals, the practice of mindfulness and ego are antagonistic with each other, that in order for us to practice mindfulness, we have to let go of ego, or that we have to strive for an egoless state of being. And then once we drop the ego, then we can somehow be one with everything. I think that's a very common kind of language that you hear in the world of mindfulness or in the world of psychotherapy or just in pop, I want to say pop psychology or pop mindfulness. I don't necessarily think that the Buddhist scholars, right, or let's say go back to the Buddha himself, I don't think that the Buddha would argue with us that there is a self. So the self is real. I just think that he may argue that the self is not really real. It's not as really real as we think that it is. So we see the ego as a fixed, solid entity, and perhaps through the study of mindfulness, through the study of Vipassana, or the study of self and selfing, we begin to see that the ego perhaps is something a bit more fluid, not as fixed. And hopefully that through the practice of mindfulness, we get to relate with an ego that it's not obsessed with its own solidity. That's what I guess from a personal perspective, that's something that I have found out about myself through sitting and going on retreats and trying to do my best with a daily practice, is that I honestly do take myself a lot less seriously today than I did 10, 20 years ago, especially 20 years ago. I was king of the world, I thought. So
can we identify some things that come from the ego? I'll throw out, identity, attachment, judgment, perhaps. I think it would be really cool to say, and there might be a gray area here, but generally speaking, what are some of the things that the ego, that we're getting from the ego? What is the ego giving us, whether consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously?
I guess if we're talking more historical in regards to like derivatives and the applicability of it, Leopold Ballack in this way, also an Austrian gentleman from Vienna who kind of expanded upon ego in regards to how this applies. And he came up with the sort of main functions of how the ego affects us. and kind of where it may come from in the brain. According to Bellick, it also has to do with the controlling impulses. It controls planning, controls dealing with external environments. It's a mix of how we feel on the inside and how that dances with the external factors in the environment. Also, Bellick also has this, 12 ego functions, an assessment battery regarding reality testing, our judgment, our sense of reality in the world and the self, the regulation and control of drives, affect and impulses, object relations, thought processes. And then he even kind of coins it with that acronym ARISE, right? Like what is this? It's the adaptive regression, the service of the ego, defensive functioning, and stimulation barrier. So what this means is, how are we acting or how are we being in the world? Is this servicing our ego and our ego only? And then the next question is, are we being a bit too egocentric in a non-judgmental way of saying, are we able to differentiate between how this is affecting us, the sense of self, or how it's affecting the rest of the world? I can say that in my applicable work, it can also serve as a relief to some clients to know that there are other pieces of our primitive brain or even our more advanced brain, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, that there are pieces of this thing that helps conduct our everyday experience, that there are pieces that we can sort of manage and be aware of. And then there's other pieces where we can accept that they will play parts in the way we make our decisions. And I guess the mindfulness piece is, right, being aware of when this may or may not be happening, and also being able to let go of the controlling of that.
I think one of our contemporary understanding of ego that we use more colloquially now is the preservation of our sense of self. And it gives us the sense of safety and solidifies our belief or our self-concept that we've developed. Because if we consider ourselves nice, and then we have a moment where we are acting outside of what we consider nice, then we're going to have that cognitive dissonance, and the ego is going to step in and fill the gaps of, well, I had to be mean in that situation because they were mean. Like the ego is going to come in and try to save you from yourself, of spiraling of this weird dissonance of, I'm a nice person, but I did something not nice. Like, how do those two puzzle pieces fit together? And instead of just devolving into a ball of anxiety, the ego is going to be like, no, it's cool. It was justified. And when it's done correctly, then, okay, it allows you to see the truth and the reality or the objective truth of the situation. But when it's taken to the pathology is when you just turn on your defenses for everything and you push people away. I'm intrigued by Claudio's thought of, would the Buddha acknowledge that there is a sense of self, or does that go against mindfulness? Because if you're thinking that I'm a strong person, are you only strong when you're lifting something heavy, or can you be strong in rest? So if you don't have the opportunity to show or display your concept of self, then can you really claim that? And then is that uncomfortable if you're not constantly proving yourself to others? So then there's this ego drive to show off, to demonstrate value. This is something that men do a lot, is men feel that they have to demonstrate value constantly. And this is why you see cisgender men more than cisgender women put a lot of pride in like just things like vehicles and clothes and jobs and tying our identity to stuff, or just talking a lot. And that's where a lot of the concept of like mansplaining comes from, because there's this conversation going on. I need everybody to know how valuable I am. So let me put my 2 cents in, even if I don't even know what I'm talking about. I just need everybody to know that I'm smart and I have something to say about this matter. But ego can be this nice protective factor that fills in the gaps of, hey, it's okay to act in a way that's incongruent with your sense of self, because our behavior is context dependent. But when it's too much in the driver's seat, then it's going to be this constant like puffing out the chest and just more of a display and pageantry than anything else. That's overcorrection. So everybody knows your sense of self, rather than just being content with, this is who I am. These are my likes. These are my dislikes. I don't care if you accept it or acknowledge it. I'm at peace knowing who I am.
And I like the way you just said, like, over something, right? Because I always see that totally to me as like an over sense of this need, right? And it's kind of digging yourself deeper and like overcompensating, right? And there, when we try to overcompensate or we find our ego trying to overcompensate, then we lack the thing that we try to achieve, which is sort of like a sense of homeostasis. But it turns out to be seen as a false sense of security, right? Because our ego said, well, just do this and they'll make you think that you're smarter. But then also leaving that conversation being like, I don't think I got recognized for that. And so that's where that sort of imbalance, you can sort of feel it and be really mindful of, the interaction of the ego.
It sounds like the ego is born out of a sense of fear or isolation. What is the role of fear and isolation within the context of the ego? In the last couple of years, I've been reading more and more of Dr. Mark Epstein, who is a psychiatrist coming from the psychoanalytic school, but also a big mindfulness practitioner. And he's got some great books out there. And that's one of the statements that really stuck with me when I read it, is that the ego is born out of fear and isolation. And in particular, we're not born with an ego. Would you agree with that? Or does ego, as you refer to as a concept, is it a mental concept that arises age 2, 3 in our consciousness? Is it a function of consciousness as a mental concept?
There's a big question, right, in regards to like, when do we start existing in regards to when the ego starts existing? Because anytime you are feeling, like that differentiation of questioning or vulnerability or fear. So that's a question that depends on, when do you recognize that is actually happening, right? Are we able to see, which we know, like in utero, we don't see the fetus spitting out cortisol or stress hormones quite yet, because it doesn't know how to compare that to the external environment. So it's questionable, like that day one when you're born, I think the ego gets developed. It's not matured, but also parts of the prefrontal cortex are not even matured. But I'd say that's the first cell of the start of the ego, if I would have to take a stab at that.
That's interesting too. So consider like deer. When two bucks are ramming their antlers against each other and they're fighting for territory, or they're fighting for this area to forage, is that ego driven, or is that driven by their biological imperative to survive? And if they have more territory, then they have more opportunity to forage and have a higher likelihood of survival. Because what's stopping them from just going to the other side of the field? There's not this abundance of deer where they're just running into each other left and right. You can drive miles without seeing one. But yet, as soon as they find each other, they don't say, hey, buddy, you keep going that way and I'll keep going this way. They immediately just charge at each other and start fighting. So applying that to us, where we have more sophisticated thoughts and we have more elaborate ways of thinking, are we actually more evolved? Or is this just an extension, the next level of evolution in our thinking of still that biological imperative to survive and or leave a legacy? Because it's not always my genetic material that has to survive. A lot of times I want something, I want to be remembered. I want to build this building with my name on it. I want to build this company that survives. I want to have this product in everyone's home. That falls in that same line. So again, is that ego, or is that the next evolutionary state of this survival imperative?
What you're alluding to, right, is the deer never gets a prefrontal cortex or parts of the prefrontal cortex that we obviously use as evolved humans. But I would say that we all do, right, at the stem of all of our brains. Even most other species have that sort of primitive automatic response of deprivation, whether they're aware of it or not. So I think it may be instinctual, right, for those deer to go head to head at each other. They may not be aware in that abstract reasoning department of, well, hey man, like I have plenty of food over here and you have plenty of food over there. But there's this primitive automatic response from deprivation that goes back to, right, survivalist mentality of like, I need to live and I need my legacy to live.
I guess I would say that the two deers in that moment are not having a moment of awareness or self-awareness and recognizing or projecting the I, the me, or the mine, which I think that that's the language of the ego, I, me, or mine. I believe that notion of I, me, or mine begins, I don't know, I told you that I was going to go see my godchildren during Thanksgiving. They're 9 years old, but I remember being with them when they were 2, 3 years old. And it seems to be like a very special time where children start to really claim this is me or this is mine. And they start to self-differentiate and attempt to make sense of themselves and others.
So I have a question. As most of our listeners likely know, part of mindfulness or the practice of mindfulness is this process of noting or labeling, which is interesting to me and something that I struggled with a bit when I took my original MBSR course. And this ability that we have as humans to observe ourselves, really intriguing. Is it possible that the ego is, if not synonymous, very similar to this idea of the thinking mind and our ability to observe it, this other side of us or other part of us, is that our consciousness? Like, is there a way to delineate the difference between the consciousness and the ego?
I think that they're distinct. The ego is distinct from that which is able to perceive the ego. So within the context of mindfulness, that is actually something really fascinating about the observing mind or the witnessing mind or whatever you want to call it. The mind that witnesses the ego is fully distinct from the ego, just like the mind that witnesses anger arise, for example. The moment that that mind witnesses, observes, makes contact with anger, it is fully distinct in quality from the anger itself. For me, it tells me that it is outside of the anger. It is different than the anger.
Based on what we were defining before, right? Like that sort of principle of the pain plus resistance equals suffering that, rings true for lots of different human conditions. But the suffering piece comes from the ego. That is one piece that has a big part in our ability to exist and feel okay and balanced, knowing that there are other parts or other conditions that are contributing to why we are experiencing what we're experiencing in that moment.
The suffering comes from the ego. Is that because the ego is creating the resistance?
Yeah, sometimes we resist to be seen because something is difficult and we don't feel comfortable being vulnerable and saying, this is just really difficult. So we resist, and that equals suffering. It can show up also in a way of, I'm not allowing this in my house or my brain or my life, so I'm going to resist. The ego says, don't let that thing in. Suffering, because the truth in life is that we do have to let some things in, whether we want to or not, and we don't have control over things that come in. And sometimes that also is very much synonymous with what the ego does.
I think taking your car metaphor like a step further, and it reminds me of William Glasser's use of the car metaphor to explain like reality therapy. And if you take the car itself as our consciousness, it's depending on who's driving it. Like we as individuals, like our individual sense of self could be driving it, or this ego defense, this ego that's protecting our sense of self can be in the driver's seat. And it can have direct and indirect control over our consciousness, depending on who's driving and what the purpose is. And then there's still things that are outside of our control that can damage or alter our trajectory of our consciousness too, whether I'm in the driver's seat and I can kind of swerve over these uncomfortable life situations, or ego's here, just bull in a china shop. Let's just put the pedal to the metal and burst through all of these things. The consciousness is going to be the one that takes the consequences of those actions, whether we're in the driver's seat trying to practice mindful existence and acceptance and non-judgment and all of these beautiful tenets that just makes mindfulness this great way of living, or we can let ego drive, and it's the sense of like, I don't want to feel uncomfortable. I don't want to feel hurt. I don't want to feel scared. I don't want limitations. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. Like you can't continue to live life like that because there's going to be negative consequences. It is going to take a toll. So there is that sense of balance of, I think, again, if we're going to go back to Freud's polar opposites, that whether if it's ourself or our ego driving 100% of the time, then, there's risk for exploitation over here with the sense of self, because there's no sense of boundaries or protecting ourselves or awareness of anything. We're just kind of go with the flow, which might not always be the worst thing. And then if the ego's driving on the other end of the spectrum, then we risk pathology like narcissism or personality disorders or those type of thinkings where we just don't even possess the capacity for empathy and connection and considering how our behaviors and, words can affect others. It serves a purpose. I mean, just like anything else, you can drink water to nourish your body, capping it at a certain amount. But if you're just drinking gallons and gallons of water a day, you're going to get water poisoning or toxicity or whatever it's called. And even that's going to be harmful. Like even too much of a good thing is going to be harmful.
And as you're saying that too, right? Just in reference to like how the ego mediates our life, right? Like of what many, the mental health world has consistently come to, like without an ego, what you said exactly is we'd all have either personality disorders or mental health conditions, right? We kind of need to know how we interact in situations. We need to know what we say and do and how that matters to others, how that affects us if we want to live a social life. And we all know social parts of our lives are imperative for us to live longer. So it's something that you do need to befriend, right? If we want to live longer or live a higher quality of life, given these conditions that we're told we need. So unfortunately, it's, again, befriending that part of it. You know, in trauma work, right? Ego has 100% to do with dissociation. So when something seems too difficult and activated, the ego says, abort, abort. And so a part of the ego structure shuts down trauma. And I say this with the most compassion and knowing of all the kind of work and EMDR and ways and psilocybin and other way assisted psychotherapies that essentially soften the ego or play with the ego a little bit to not have walls be put up from being able to move to the next level of healing. And I say healing in a way of coming to an optimal or status quo like quality of life that we all kind of want to live. Remember in elementary school, we had like peer mediation and there'd be like two students like having a dispute. And usually it was something, you know, pretty mundane. Retrospectively, at the time, it felt like the end of the world. And the mediator would be like, let me hear your side and let me hear your side. And I'd say that person double dutching both lines is kind of like the ego needing to understand both sides and then saying there's no right or wrong here, understanding that these two existence and experiences have mixed together to create this. So yeah, kind of like double dutching the conscious and unconscious is, I think, what I see as the ego.
I love that, the double dutch of the ego. That's memorable. You know, going back to that question of what supports the ego or what is the function of ego. And it sounds like we're also talking about how do we regulate the ego? Because I think that we're all in accordance that there is a function of the ego, which is valuable. So going back to this notion of what regulates the ego, what is the ego regulated from? That's the first question that comes to my mind. And I drew up a list here of what the ego loves. And there's three things in particular that the ego loves: certainty, security, and repetition. And when we have fear of letting go the ego, how does certainty, security, and repetition play into that right there?
I would say to add to that, yeah, I think that's excellent. But I would add to that the ego also loves this sense of, like, as Patrick was saying before, a sense of satisfaction and gratification or approval, or when we seek reassurance, that's also the ego. So I would just add to what you already said, which was already incredibly beautiful. The ego also loves satisfaction, gratification, approval.
I imagine that the vast majority of pathologies that you come across in your practice, is it from individuals that have an overinflated ego, or is it from individuals that have, let's say, diminished sense of ego? Are the most common pathologies that are out there today in society, are they caused by too little ego or too much ego?
That's a good question.
I'd say it's a nice mixed bag of both.
Right.
And I know that sounds like a lame answer.
Yeah.
But it's true. It really depends on the individual and how they've experienced their life and their interpretations and the amount of positivity and reassurance that they've gotten from people who they care about and respect and love and their resources. So some people are really down and out and blame themselves and self-blame and self-shame. And that's probably like a diminished ego. And there are other people on the other end that are sort of dissociate from how they affect others. And in that case, I'd say there's an inflated ego or someone who has a sort of unmanaged personality disorder.
I thought I was dropping these knowledge bomb questions today. That I'm going to be thinking about that for the rest of the day. But it's interesting when you consider people that complete suicide, that it comes as a shock. Like there was no outward display of suffering, and then come to find out that they've been suffering with depression for years. But like on paper, I won't use Robin Williams because he's had some like medical stuff that was kind of going on at the same time. But like someone similar to Robin Williams' position, where it's like this outwardly happy person, mega movie star, beloved by many, didn't want for anything, had more money than they knew what to do with. And then to complete a suicide, it's like, but I don't get it. Like on paper, they had everything. Another good example is Doug Kenny, who was one of the founders of the National Lampoon franchise. And there's this amazing book that was written about him that was turned into a movie called A Futile and Stupid Gesture. One of my favorite movies. But he's one of those very ego-driven individuals that enough was never enough. Like if people were laughing, they needed to laugh more. If this movie was number one, I need 2 movies that are number one. If this show is doing well, I need 3 shows that are doing well. And that's very ego-driven because all of his worldly needs were satisfied. He was beloved by many. He was this genius, and similar to Freud, did a lot of drugs, very intelligent, but just enough was never enough. And that to me is very ego-driven. That's your ego saying, hey, this feels really cool. Let's get more of this, rather than the sense of, we've talked about savoring in the past, like taking a step back and realizing I've built this phenomenal franchise. I wrote Caddyshack. I've been on the top of everything. And instead of savoring and being in the moment and applying some mindfulness, the ego comes in. It's like, but is this really all that you're capable of? Was that your magnum opus, or do you need one more?
The ego is also part of like, am I enough? Did I do enough? Am I too much? Am I too little? And so I like Leon Seltzer's version of this too. There's a really good article on Psychology Today about individuals like with our egos. Do we need strengthening or shrinking? And the difference between a big ego and a strong, secure ego. So it's really about how much, according to that piece of it. So your question is almost like statistically will vary depending on what population you're working with and who you've assessed and who's kind of in your wheelhouse that you're working with, like from a clinical practice perspective. But it'd be interesting to break that down, because that is an incredibly subjective, like, I don't know if we'll ever be able to pinpoint that statistic, but now you have me thirsty for that as well.
Well, that ego, like giving us a sense of safety, like I think the opposite of the Doug Kenny scale would be do I deserve what I have? I struggled with this when I first started doing community mental health, where I would go work with primarily homeless populations. Then I would come home and I would sit there in bed and think like, man, I get to go to sleep in a bed with a roof over my head with all these resources, and people that I just saw 3 hours ago, I know are sleeping on the street right now. And it gave me the sense, like, again, that referential thinking that our ego does is, let me compare to others. Do I deserve this? What makes me more deserving of this privilege than them? Like, what makes me more deserving to have this house and this education and this resources and stuff versus them? So I think if the ego is out of balance, if it's too much where it can never be fed, or it's too little where you don't feel that you're deserving or can't even apply mindfulness because there's the sense of like, yeah, but I don't deserve it. Yeah, but this doesn't feel right. Then yeah, I definitely think those scales can fluctuate, and there needs to be this sense of homeostasis in the middle of a healthy ego.
This podcast is sponsored by the Austin Mindfulness Center, the premier mental health counseling center in Texas for mindfulness-based therapy, education, and coaching. If you're an individual or couple struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, or you're just looking to better equip yourself to gracefully navigate these turbulent times, you can visit us online at austinmindfulness.org and request an appointment today. Now let's get back to our podcast.
One writer that comes to mind that I've been getting into in the last couple of months is David Foster Wallace. And you see in that character is the ego has the capacity to exaggerate, right? In the case of Doug Kenny, always exaggerate, want more, but it also has a capacity to diminish reality. So in the case of David Foster Wallace, he was always questioning his value as a human being and as a writer. And he really battled with that during his whole life. Wrote perhaps one of the greatest American contemporary masterpieces, Infinite Jest, and then ended up committing suicide. I would recommend all of you to really catch some of those interviews that he has and the way that he shares and opens up about the pain that he felt around understanding his role, his contribution, and his ego. So it was very, very interesting.
It's almost as if this kind of came to me. It's like the ego makes you question whether you deserve or not deserve unconditional love. It's making you question, if I feel less, if I seem less, will I still be loved? Do I still deserve to be here? Mm-hmm. And the answer is always yes.
Let's continue to play on this theme of identifying ideas or concepts or maybe even beliefs that the ego is handing to us. I'm thinking about things like attachment, any of our attachments, as well as our identity. Are these all ego driven? I assume so.
What do you mean by attachments? Are you talking about like relational attachments or attachments to?
Right. So we can become attached to possessions, to knowledge, to roles, our likes and dislikes, right? Opinions, things that we believe are true or not. Anything that we can be attached to in this life, I believe, begins to allow the ego to identify who we are, which then, in my mind, feeds our identity. Is that too big of a leap of faith? Am I connecting dots that are very far away?
No, but I also want to say too, I'm like doubting. No, I'm not going to doubt it. I'm going to say that everything that we encounter as a human has some sort of ego innervation. So I think that would definitely apply to attachment theory and what Patrick was saying before, right? Of, the concept, like the popular concept locally of like mansplaining, et cetera, or the attachment to a vehicle. There is this ego voice saying, you are loved because you have this cool car. You are loved because you're smart. You are loved because X, Y, or Z, right? So the ego is creating conditions. You are loved because you know a lot. So the ego is creating conditions to be like, yeah, just tell them that you know this already. They'll love you. And that's where if we don't check our ego, it can really be sort of problematic. It always questions the how and why and we exist, and will this bring more value to my existence? But again, that is also an illusion of the ego.
Yeah, because I mean, we didn't necessarily love things that didn't bring us joy to love, right? Like I love both of my dogs, but if one of my dogs were a D-bag that just like chewed everything up and bit me every time I saw them, would I actually love them? And no, I love these two because they cuddle with me. They lick my face. They're excited when I get home. And is that ego? Like, am I conditioned to love them because they stroked my ego and made me feel like a worthy pet owner? I think that there is a relational aspect with attachment and an ego, because it's all on a value system. What does this do for me? If we're looking at the bro that has the biggest truck with the biggest lift on it, is he actually attached to the truck itself? Or is this an individual that's attached to the attention the truck brings him? So then what is the attachment to really? Because in that sense, the attachment is really just to the ego. I like it when my ego is stroked, whether it be through people admiring my vehicle or my cool Von Dutch hat or any of my other possessions that give me attention. It's more of this attachment to this feeling that I get by peacocking all of this stuff, essentially.
Yeah, but we can see the danger, right, of being attached to feeling positive about yourself due to external validation. Because one truth about external validation is that it will change inevitably. You will be praised one day, so people will give you kudos one day, and then you will be blamed the next day. Within the context of mindfulness, one function of mindfulness is to not become so attached to the praise, so that way when the blame comes, it's easier to let that go.
But in a good way, I'm also going to reframe that into something that's somewhat positive and saying that one part of it is that experience and that thought process, that domino effect of what that neural pathway that's going on there, at least it's assuring you that you do deserve to feel positive. You do deserve to exist and feel good about existing. However, there are other ways of doing this besides something so immediate and maybe not as big of an existence as you want it to be. And so if you want to feel okay and healthy about other parts of your life, it would have to extend beyond who you are and how you treat people, et cetera, beyond the things that you own.
Is it fair to say that the ego perhaps is playing a role in the process of, and I'll just say men, is it playing a role in keeping men, as an example, from learning mindfulness? Or perhaps I should remove gender from that, right? But is ego playing a role that's people maybe are thinking, yeah, you know what, I'm fine. I don't need mindfulness. I'm good.
I think we should keep gender in it because one, men just need to be taken down a peg because we are very ego driven. But again, that goes back to the biological sense of like survival of you had a higher likelihood of survival if you were the biggest man, the strongest man, the one that reproduced with the most women. That sense of competition, I think, is still there. And even though we don't need that anymore, like we have enough people on the planet, like we can kind of slow down with the population side of things. But that primal urge is still there. It's just coming out and manifesting in different ways. It is coming out with the mansplaining, with toxic masculinity, with dominating conversations. So I definitely think gender is an important role because men tend to be more egocentric than women are. And I would be interested in what like the new research is on gender fluidity and the new gender identities that are coming out. Like what role does ego have in those areas and those gender identities? And I think it's an important concept to have, but yes, definitely to your point, it is interfering. It is a significant barrier to practicing mindful living. And also I'll bring up Doug Kinney one more time and then I'll stop. But one of the best things, he had this mindfulness revelation. One of the last things that he wrote was a letter that they found in his room. He passed away in Hawaii. Either he fell or jumped off a cliff. No one really knows. One of the last things he wrote was, "These are the happiest days I've ever ignored." So there was even the sense of mindfulness of like, oh crap, I did have everything I wanted. And I didn't live mindfully to actually enjoy them. I just ignored them all.
We do need to wrap up this episode. So let's do this. Let's go around the room like we often do and provide some takeaways. My thought would be it would be most helpful to our listeners to help them perhaps identify when they could or how they could label their ego or note it like, oh, there it goes. There's my ego again telling me to X, Y, or Z, and then what they can or should or could do at that time. To me, that seems like the most pragmatic takeaway that we could provide at the end of an episode about ego.
You mean how to let go of the ego? Is that what you're saying? That's really simple, right? I'm saying everything that we've been talking about is like how complex the ego is and pervasive.
So the reason I started with being like, what is it that comes from the ego? Because the ego is not going to come over and say, hey, I'm the ego here telling you that you're X, right? So we first have to identify it. Here's our ego, and what is a wise response to that? What is a wholesome response after we've identified that may not necessarily be true. That's just my ego telling once again, this is true.
There will be no way to eliminate the ego. I'd say the best, most successful, beneficial, calmest way to interact with this part of us is to embrace it, to befriend the enemy, to recognize any boundaries, fears of what that is like, right? Of befriending our enemy. Because again, our ego will tell us, well, if you start to have a conversation with your enemy, you may lose. And so that's, again, the ego. So befriending that part of us and becoming calm, I would say a big part in practical life when ego innervates, which happens multiple, sometimes thousands of times a day, of questioning something in a black and white matter or anything that provides quote unquote comfort. So if you're like, can I do this better? Was this bad? Was this good? Any like one category, because we want that category to provide safety and clarity. But I would also say that's a false sense of security. That's our ego saying, well, just put it into this box or that box, and then we'll be okay. So my takeaway is that it's inevitable if you want to live, I think, a high quality of life, to have to befriend the enemy, be patient with yourself, be calm with yourself. It is parts of you. You got this. It may be scary, but you got this. You've already been dealing with this fight and battle almost your entire life, but maybe this is the time to, instead of call that out, but call them in.
I think it might be just that easy, Lance, like you said, of just like acknowledging it and letting it go. I think the hard part is the acknowledging part. So if we're looking at that formula, I think it's like the 6th episode in a row we brought it up, the pain times resistance equals suffering. I think that resistance component is the place to stop. Like pain is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's out of our control most of the time. Sometimes it's in our control. But as soon as we start resisting, as soon as we start increasing that suffering from that pain, that's the indicator of like, okay, something's not right. Like, am I trying to bargain out of the situation? Am I having an ego defense? Am I sublimating? Am I projecting? Am I putting the blame somewhere else rather than just kind of sitting with it and recognizing, oh, this is a very ego-driven move. I'm trying to resist the reality of a situation of either I messed up or I don't know anything about this topic, so I shouldn't contribute to it. I'm not in control right now. Something was taken away from me and I just have to accept it. I think when we acknowledge when we're resisting, it'll be much easier to kind of contend and accept and let go. I also, like, even now, don't really have an ego when it comes to teaching. If a student doesn't like my class and it's like, well, that sucks. Like you're enrolled here. I know that there's others that do. It's not going to hurt my feelings. If I have a bad fit with a client and early on in my career, I'm like, they need to like me. I went to school. Like I'm really smart, guys. Like I know so many words, but now it's like, I'm not everybody's cup of tea. That's fine. Where I will let my ego control is like when I'm visiting my mom, because she knows exactly how to push my ego buttons. And for some reason I have to be right when we're remembering a memory. And it's like, no. And anyways, I'm getting worked up, but you can see that we can master the sense of ego response in some areas, but not in others. But I think the better that we get at catching up to it and catching it before it gets into the driver's seat, the better that we'll fare.
That's beautiful advice. Why I say it's beautiful, because you kind of took it somewhere that I wasn't expecting that you would take it, which is
blaming my mom. I'm only doing that because I know she's listening.
Meaning like taking it away from the intellect and moving it into the body, into the felt sense of like, what does this resistance feel like in my body right now? What is this constriction around my chest or my heart? Why are my hands feeling this way? Why is my breath feeling this way? And being able to feel the feelings that arise when there is a damage to the ego or when there is some kind of attack on the ego. That path is rich because the ego loves to validate itself, and the place where it validates itself is in the intellect. Moving to the body, moving to the felt sense, and moving to the somatic experience, I think it's wise. If you do want to use a little bit of cognitive, I think this would be along the CBT approach. When you experience yourself in the midst or in the thrall of an ego attack, whatever that may be, ask yourself 3 questions. Whatever I'm thinking, is it true? Is it kind? And is it timely?
You bring up intellectualization, right? Which is what we know as a specific ego defense, right? And it's just one of many ego defenses we do. And so, sorry to chime in again. You guys thought I was finished. One more thing is just like anytime we feel like we need to control anything or controlling us, that's when the ego's in the room.
I like the, is it true? There's been so many times when I was in couples counseling where you reach that uncomfortable part where both parties are correct. It's not one of those who's right, who's wrong. Like y'all are both right in this perspective. So where do we go from here? Rather than like true, meaning like this has to have a right or wrong. Somebody has to be in the right and somebody has to be at fault. When in reality, like, no, that's the ego talking. So I like that. The recognition of, is this true? Or is this my perception?
In order to practice mindfulness, we commonly hear that we need to let go of the ego. But if you're a student like me, you might struggle with this. I know I do. Because it's not always easy to identify when the ego is driving or influencing us. One thing is clear though, if we can bring intention and awareness to the observation of the ego, we can begin to implement positive changes in our lives. Partly because we're acknowledging the ego and seeing it for what it is, recognizing when the ego is driving our car, our lives, and then intentionally saying to the ego, no thanks, I've got this. And then we consciously, carefully change our response to one that is more wholesome and helpful. Today I learned that the ego is more than just the thinking mind. But I think it's fair to say that the ego is a primary driver of the thinking mind. For now, let's just say that the ego and the thinking mind are really good friends, and that may not necessarily be a great thing. If we can learn to let go of the ego, we'll make more room or more space to have a better relationship with our thinking mind and bring more of our decisions and thoughts and actions to our conscious awareness. Living consciously seems to be the key to mindfulness. Perhaps that's the easiest and most elementary definition of mindful living. It's living consciously, being aware of our thoughts and emotions, and not letting them drive us. It's about not getting lost in thought or letting us happen in the world randomly, but instead to put our hands on the wheel and make more intentional, conscious decisions about the lives we're living and living the life we want to live. We're not done talking about the ego just yet. Next week, we're going to go a little deeper and broach the topic of how we can tame the ego. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I hope you'll join us. Take care.